The historical period called the Renaissance began in Italy around the year 1350, and for the next 3 centuries, Renaissance innovations in art, architecture, science, and religion spread slowly across the European continent. The word Renaissance means rebirth, for it was during the Renaissance that European civilization began to move away from the somber medieval ideals so well symbolized by that age's dark castles and brooding cathedrals, into the light of a new era. The Renaissance was a unique historical period, for the leaders of the Renaissance found much of their inspiration in the great art and literature of the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome. And here, among these ruins, the leaders of the Renaissance rediscovered some wonderful ideas that had been all but lost for nearly 1,000 years. Because the Renaissance was founded on the rediscovery of a long-lost way of life, it is important to spend some time comparing life in ancient Roman times to life during the nearly 1,000 years of the Middle Ages that immediately preceded the Renaissance. For only in this way can this marvelous period of history be understood. At its peak around the year 120 AD, Rome ruled a great empire that encompassed all of Western Europe and much of North Africa and the Near East. Every province of this vast empire was linked to Rome by over 50,000 miles of roads paved with stones. For wherever the Romans conquered, they brought civilization to a very primitive world. Rome itself was a city of marble temples, triumphal arches, and glorious palaces. The Romans, just like the older Greek culture they so freely borrowed from, formed a highly civilized society, bound together by a well-developed system of government and law. However, over the centuries, Rome's fantastic wealth led to corruption, complacency, and decadence. As the Roman Empire weakened from within, it began to collapse under the continued attacks of barbaric tribes such as the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, and Vandals. And by 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire finally disintegrated. Its army was shattered, and the once beautiful city of Rome lay in ruin. What happened in the former Roman province of Britain with the arrival of 3 Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons, was typical of what happened wherever the barbarians stepped in to take the place of the departing Romans. Roman towns were torn apart for their stones and bricks. Their beautiful sculptures, masterfully carved from solid marble that once adorned their homes and temples, were smashed beyond recognition. And the engineering skills that had brought running water, paved roads, warm public baths, and excellent drainage systems to Roman towns did not exist among the barbarians. And soon all these reminders of a more civilized way of life were forgotten. The new Anglo-Saxon villages that began to appear across Britain were quite primitive compared to the Roman towns. And because many artistic skills were lost, the art that adorned their simple dwellings appears very crude by Roman standards. The collapse of the highly civilized Roman culture and its replacement by a barbarous, uncivilized society marked Europe's entry into the Middle Ages, the name historians have given the middle period of European history between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. Additionally, historians named the first 500 years of the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, to reflect the rapid decline of a more civilized way of life during this era. As Europe entered the Dark Ages, the ancient religion of the Romans finally died out. The old gods and goddesses of Rome, and even the Norse gods of the barbarians, were soon forgotten as Europe embraced Christianity. As Christianity took hold, the new Christians became increasingly concerned with the welfare of their souls and with the consequences of their deeds, both good and bad. And as their concern grew, their thoughts turned inward. And it was not until the Renaissance that this inner exploration of the soul shifted into an outward exploration of the world. During the Middle Ages, nearly everyone believed that life on earth was of little value in and of itself. Life was seen merely as the doorway leading either to the eternal pleasures of heaven or to the demons of hell. Medieval artwork reinforced these beliefs, taught Bible stories, and acted to inspire a deep sense of religious devotion among the mostly illiterate population of Europe. During the last part of the Middle Ages, known as the High Middle Ages, this powerful devotion was expressed by an enormous upsurge of religious building, as stonemasons carved delicate ornaments for the huge new cathedrals and monasteries that sprouted up across the countryside. And by the 1200s, more than 10% of the population of Europe lived the religious life as monks, nuns, or priests. Yet strangely enough, this time of intense religious devotion was a period of almost continuous warfare. And the many castles constructed during the last few centuries of the Middle Ages stand as lasting reminders of this fact. Under Rome, most of Europe was united under a central government and its laws. And Rome's powerful military maintained peace in Europe for over 2 centuries. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, many small independent kingdoms emerged, and relentless warfare was the order of the day, as rival kingdoms battled to increase their wealth by winning land from their foes. And because of this constant warfare, society in the Middle Ages organized itself according to the principles of feudalism. Under the feudal system, the powerful noblemen who controlled the land exchanged protection for the labor or military service of their subjects. For example, the serfs who worked the noblemen's lands exchanged some of the crops they raised for the protection the Lord provided from the hostile forces of other kingdoms. But the feudal system began to collapse as the bubonic plague struck Europe in the mid-1300s, resulting in the death of nearly 1/4 of the population of Europe. At the same time, the Catholic Church had become very worldly and in need of reform. Bishops lived like princes, and the church sold religious favors called indulgences for money. During the 1300s, 2 or for a while even 3 men each claimed to be the true pope, and these disputes created much confusion among the Christians at that time. Amid this medieval background of religious confusion, plague, and warfare, a new direction for society was born in Italy around 1350. And this new direction has come to be known as the Renaissance. Primarily here in Florence, and in Siena, Milan, and Venice, small groups of artists, writers, and scholars came together. They sought to find a new course for the civilization of Western Europe, one that truly reflected mankind's enormous abilities they believed had been too long suppressed or just plain forgotten. Because the leaders of the Renaissance had lost their respect both for the hierarchy of the church and for the feudal lords who ruled their lives, they turned elsewhere in their search for new ideas. These leaders of the Renaissance were called humanists because their interest focused on the people whose works had brought greatness to the cultures of ancient Greece and Rome. These humanists began to explore and study the mysterious ruins of ancient Rome, and to retranslate the few ancient Greek and Roman books that had survived the barbarians. From the earliest days of the Renaissance, artists began to be inspired by the realistic portrayals of the human body they saw in the Roman sculptures they unearthed. For the artists of the Middle Ages had viewed the human body mostly as an obstacle to a religious life and made no attempt to show its beauty. Partially for this reason, the figures in medieval art usually have a very flat, unlifelike appearance. But soon the great Renaissance artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael were creating lifelike paintings of human beings by using rich colors and subtle shading that actually glorified the human body. These artists in accurately portraying the human body led to the first really scientific studies of human anatomy since the work of the Roman scientist Galen over 1,300 years earlier. Again, bodies were being dissected in an attempt to understand how they function. Renaissance artists also had discovered how to create the illusion of three dimensions on the flat surface of a painting by using perspective. Perspective is created when figures in the foreground are made taller than those in the background. The correct heights to paint the figures are determined simply by following sets of converging guidelines that can later be painted over. The illusion of depth created by using perspective in paintings seemed almost magical to people who lived during the Renaissance, almost as magical as the first photographs were to people in the 19th century. The magic and beauty found in Renaissance paintings could also be found in the wonderful buildings constructed during that time. The great Renaissance Cathedral of Florence, seen here, shows how ornate detail and delicately colored marble were combined to inspire a deep religious feeling. Much of this cathedral's ornamentation also shows the design influence of the Muslim culture that was gaining in strength around the Mediterranean during this era. Changes were also occurring in the way that houses were being built during the Renaissance. And these changes reflected the decline of feudalism and the rise of trade with the stability this brought. In England, as in much of the rest of Europe, the houses of the great feudal lords were being transformed from medieval fortresses into places of beauty, comfort, and elegance. This Renaissance house, called Burton Agnes Hall, appears very civilized when compared to the rooms of this tower that housed the feudal lords who had first settled here in the 12th century. When construction began on Burton Agnes Hall at the end of the 16th century, it was considered to be a very modern building. Unlike the original medieval house, the new hall had no fortifications at all. Instead, its large windows let the comfortable rooms inside be flooded with light, and at the same time allowed those inside to admire the lovely gardens and fountains outside. And like any Roman palace, this fine Renaissance house was adorned with marble statues of gods and goddesses. As the first bricks of Burton Agnes Hall were being cemented together in 1599, William Shakespeare watched the walls of his new theater go up 300 miles to the south in London. The plays of Shakespeare, considered to be the greatest writer in the English language, revitalized the art of theatrical performance, which had been a major source of entertainment in ancient Rome, but had declined tremendously during the Middle Ages.
From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
To this day, Shakespearean plays are performed in many countries around the world and remain very popular because of the timeless themes that Shakespeare employed in his writing. Besides improvements in the arts, great things were also happening in the world of science during the Renaissance. In 1610, near the end of the Renaissance, and 6 years before the death of Shakespeare, Galileo Galilei's use of the newly invented telescope allowed him to prove the astronomical theories proposed by Nicolaus Copernicus in the preceding century, namely that the Earth rotates on its axis once a day and rotates around the Sun once a year. Another marvelous late Renaissance scientific accomplishment was the invention of the microscope around 1590 in Holland. The microscope revealed a hidden world no one had even imagined to have existed before, where just a single drop of water was discovered to be filled with tiny living things one early microscopist called cavorting beasties. The invention of the microscope allowed an enormous increase of scientific understanding to occur in the studies of biology and medicine. The growth of scientific knowledge during the Renaissance had been fueled by the invention around 1450 of a printing press that used movable type. Because this new invention resulted in the mass production of inexpensive books, scientists and other educated people of the Renaissance were able to share ideas in ways that had not been possible in the past. Up until the mid-1400s, books were copied by hand instead of being printed on a printing press. Hand copying was a slow process, and as a result, books were very rare and expensive. During the medieval era, because of the scarcity of books, new ideas did not travel very fast from one location to another. But with the large-scale adoption of inexpensive printing methods after 1500, new ideas began to move across Europe fairly rapidly. The enthusiasm that led people of the Renaissance to publish new books, analyze the movement of the planets, develop exciting new techniques in art, and to study life under the microscope also led them to undertake an unprecedented exploration of the Earth itself. Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492 in a search for a direct shipping route from Europe to Asia and accidentally discovered North and South America. And by 1522, Ferdinand Magellan had sailed all the way around the world. As a result of this burst of exploration, many of the native cultures of the Americas suffered near total destruction as they confronted not just the superior weapons, but also the diseases brought by the Europeans. But as Europeans began to settle in the Americas, they also brought with them European culture and the Christian religion. Not only were Europeans in the Renaissance exploring the unmapped regions of the world, they were also exploring new ways of expressing their Christian faith. In 1517, in response to corruption within the Catholic Church, a German monk named Martin Luther called for its complete reform. Luther questioned the right of the Church to sell indulgences. He also questioned the authority of the Pope, as well as the accuracy of many of the Catholic interpretations of the Bible. And this movement, now called the Reformation, led to a breakup of the Catholic Church's total control of the Christian faith and led to the formation of many different Protestant churches. One of the most significant results of the Reformation was that the power of kings increased as the power of the popes decreased. The clearest example of this increase of kingly power can be found in the English Reformation of 1534 that was led by King Henry VIII. Henry had decided he needed a new wife since his first wife had failed to give him a son and heir. Because the church forbid divorce, Henry needed to obtain an annulment from the Pope in order to remarry. But when the Pope denied his request, Henry stripped the Pope of his authority and declared himself to be the head of the church in England. Henry seized all the church's property, dismantled every monastery in England, and went on to marry 5 more times. And so it was that during the Renaissance, sovereign nations all across Europe began to steer a new course that gradually freed them from domination by the papacy. About 3 centuries after it had begun, the Renaissance, with its fantastic vision of cultural rebirth, had come to a successful conclusion, having produced a new sense of freedom in religion, in thought, and in government, as well as leaving behind a rich legacy of art, literature, science, and exploration. European civilization had traveled far during the Renaissance. Feudalism had been exchanged for a new way of life that centered on trade that resulted in the growth of cities. And when the Renaissance came to a close around 1650, much of Europe stood at the threshold of a new era, ready to meet the great challenges that were to lie ahead in what historians were to call the Age of Reason.